tiny light vessel on the water versus the wrath of nature. Sounds fun, right? Fighting against rapids or floating on a calm lake in a kayak. While that could be enjoyable, never forget, there are unnatural things at work in the wild, and sometimes they may just stumble upon you. Enjoy these scary kayaking stories and scary lake stories. Now let's begin. A couple of years ago, I rented a house that was 2 blocks away from a fairly large lake. I always wanted to own a boat, and one day on an impulse, I bought a cheap little blue kayak at my local big box store. It was so much of an impulse buy that I didn't even have room enough in my car to bring it home. I had to call my parents to bring their van to help me move it. Then I realized when I got it home that I had no way to get it to the water. After carrying my new kayak by hand a few times and almost throwing out my back in the process, I finally shelled out for a set of boat wheels so I could roll it to the shore instead. My first few times out on the lake were a bit scary, even though I live in northern Illinois, far from any dangerous aquatic predators. I couldn't help but worry about what was under the dark water I was slowly paddling over. Could there be some behemoth creature below? Maybe a huge snapping turtle that had grown to an unnatural size and was just waiting to ram into the underside of my craft, flipping me into the water to feed on my soft flesh. It didn't help that occasionally, strange loud thuds would sound from under me, like something large was just below me, gently nudging my kayak to test its strength. I assumed these were logs floating just below the surface, but I was never quite sure. That's not to say I didn't enjoy my time on the lake. Even though I was always a bit on guard, the water would sometimes become wonderfully clear, and I could look down at the beautiful waving lake plants and see little fish darting and flashing away into shadows. I eventually got up the courage to paddle along the entire circumference of the lake and found it took me about an hour to get all the way around. This lake was situated in a suburban area, and most of its shore was dotted by houses with an occasional break for a forested hill too steep to build on. There was one country club with a large dock for the members' boats, and halfway around a little park with an arched bridge that crossed a narrow channel that led into it. I explored this channel, but found it quickly ended in a drainage pipe too small to pass through. The most intriguing part of the lakeshore was the northern side, which became much shallower and almost turned into a kind of swamp, with the water giving way to tall, waving reeds. This part of the lake almost looked like a grassy field, entirely green with lily pads. I would often surprise turtles on logs as I plowed my way through its dense floating plant surface, or scare large herons who would croak scoldingly at me and flap away into the sky. This is where I found the mouth of the canal. It was an old canal built decades ago for the people who lived in the surrounding houses to access the lake. Its mouth was bordered by rusty metal retention walls and half choked with the low-hanging limbs of trees, but there was still a slim passage inside. I hesitated the first time I saw it, worrying that I would get stuck if I entered, and eyeing its dark green, almost black water, which looked strangely threatening. When I finally worked up the courage, I found the entrance easy and was surprised by what I found inside. The canal wound its way through an old neighborhood that had seen better times. The houses that lined each side of it were mostly in disrepair, with sagging roofs and backyards choked with unmown grass, overgrown bushes, and piles of old rusty junk. Most of the docks that these houses had once had were rotten and in shambles, half sunk in the water and green with moss. A few houses still had functioning docks, an old faded rowboat with an outboard motor tied to one, a new fishing rod leaning against another, but these were exceptions. Most of the docks were beyond repair, and clearly most of the people who still lived here didn't have the resources or desire to go boating. The trees hung low over the canal, making it a dark green tunnel. The smell was awful, a pungent odor of old lakeweed that stank of rotting wood and mud, and maybe something worse. I didn't see any people. The yards were deserted, even though it was a beautiful summer afternoon. I eyed the dark water and listened for any bumps beneath my kayak. After 10 minutes of paddling and following sharp twists and turns, I came to a concrete-walled retention pond choked with the lily pads and the end of the canal. Beyond the overgrown bushes, I could hear a road and its traffic. I dreaded going back the way I came, but I had no other choice. As I slowly turned and retraced my path, I couldn't help stare at the black water around me, thinking about what could be lurking below it. I swore I'd never come back here, but unfortunately I did. It was a late summer evening, the sky a blood orange red. These cicadas were droning so loud it almost hurt my ears as I paddled home along the northern shore of the lake, drenched in sweat and lake water which had been thrown up from my paddle. I looked over to my right and saw the dark mouth of the canal. For some reason, I was gripped with a desire to see it again, to defeat my fear of it. I bravely paddled forward as the sun set and the air grew purple, the details around me becoming indistinct. I knew I should hurry home. I'd never tried boating in the dark, and I had no light with me, but I kept paddling. Inside the canal, it was much darker, as if night had already fallen there. The loud roar of cicadas was muted within the arch of trees, echoing quieter and quieter, as if I had entered a large dark building. The smell of rot was overpowering, as was the silence. No frog or cricket sang as I paddled deeper down the canal, careful not to splash the water too loudly. I stopped suddenly and let the kayak drift. Ahead of me, I heard a screen door slam and the sound of boots clamping along a dock. The door creaked and slammed again, and another pair of boots joined the first. I heard muffled voices, but couldn't make out what they were saying. All I could tell was that they were whispering angrily. I listened so intently I forgot that I'd continued drifting forward. I lowered my paddle into the water and tried to stop myself without making any noise. Ahead of me, I saw the twin cherries of 2 cigarettes lit up, faintly lighting the 2 faces of 2 men. Their faces looked angry and stressed. I considered turning around, but something told me to stop and to stay where I was, as if letting these men know I was there was the worst thing I could do. I drifted under a low-hanging tree and grabbed one of its branches, my hand clutching it like a cold vice, surprised by how tense I'd become. One of the men spoke, "Help me lift her." Both men turned and walked off the dock. I was about to turn my kayak around and get out of there when the men almost immediately returned, grunting with effort and carrying a large white sack. The sack was stained red, and I realized what I was looking at. Based on its size and how much the 2 men were struggling to lift it, it had to be a body. I gasped and tried to stop the moment I did. The men didn't hear me. They were too busy carrying the body down the dock, hefting it into an old rowboat with an outboard motor. My eyes felt hot and burned, but I didn't blink once as they started the engine and roared towards me, down the canal, towards the lake where I'd come from. They literally passed me and my kayak under the overhanging tree by a couple of feet, but somehow they didn't see me. To this day, I don't know how they missed me. I was now faced with 3 choices: paddle back the way I came, and risk running into those men who were most likely murderers, get out of my kayak now, and try to find my way back to my house along the back roads of this neighborhood that I didn't know, or take my kayak to the end of the canal and flag down a car on the road. I didn't have my cell phone with me, so my only option was to find someone who did. But who could I trust in this neighborhood? For all I knew, the house I might choose could be owned by the murderers themselves. I decided to try the road, but I didn't rush, as much as I wanted to let the police know what I'd seen. I didn't want to let anyone in that house know I was here. How was I to know if those 2 men were the only ones who lived there? That was maybe the most scared I've ever been in my life, trying to paddle past that house without making noise, without even breathing. My eyes had adjusted to the dark, and I could faintly see the empty, curtainless windows of that house, watching me blankly as I crept past on the black water. The rest was a blur. Somehow I made it to the end of the canal without my heart bursting out of my chest. Somehow I climbed up the steep concrete wall of the retention pond and flagged down a car, making it to a gas station where I called the police. Somehow I was able to guide them back to the house in a police boat, huddled in fear against the side of the boat as the officers raked the house with spotlights and called in the address to the patrol cars. I never heard the whole story, but I got pieces that night and later. The house by the canal had been vacant for at least 3 years, and the previous owners were not suspected of being involved. The rowboat had been found on the south side of the lake by a patch of woods, a small blood stain on its deck that was collected for analysis. The lake was dragged multiple times and thoroughly explored by divers, but no white blood-stained bag with a body in it was ever found. To this day, I don't know if the police ever identified who the blood they found belonged to, or even if they entirely believed my story. The only thing I do know is that days later, when I finally got up the nerve to recover my kayak where I'd left it in the retention pond, there was no kayak to be found. I am from a town in southern Wisconsin. There are many lakes nearby, and among them is the one that my story takes place in. This lake used to be a very popular summer destination for rich tourists from Chicago, and it's a really rural area, being mostly comprised of farms. But I digress. About 100 years ago, the lake was abandoned as a summer getaway. The residings of something, a monster, supposedly a 75 feet long snake-like creature, according to some witnesses. Now, a little-known fact about the lake is that it had a tunnel going between it and another lake about a quarter-mile away. It's still not generally known, except by locals who are interested in such things, myself being one of them. Allegedly, this creature had been caught on several occasions devouring sheep from nearby farms and leaving their mutilated corpses on the beaches of the smaller lake. The monster is nocturnal. Some say it also killed a farmhand one time, and the only part of him they found was an arm washed up onto a beach. That all happened 100 years ago. There have been a few things since then that have kept me suspicious for a while, that this thing might still be around. If I had to guess, I'd say it hibernates for extended periods of time, then resurfaces to feed every so often on the fish that are plentiful in the lakes. Now for my encounter. It was an early morning in the summer. My grandparents had bought a house on the lake a while after the killings had driven the price to the dirt, and I was staying there with my siblings, as well as our aunt and uncle who owned the kayaks. I really enjoyed kayaking then. I was kayaking alone that day. Not exactly the brightest idea, I know, but it was a really beautiful morning. At about 5 a.m. I'd set out. It was still dark then, and the world was lit by nothing but starlight. I paddled out slowly, so as to not disturb the absolute stillness of the early morning water. In hindsight, this probably saved my life, as the creature didn't hear my slow paddles, quietly dipping in and out of the water. After about half a mile out onto the water, I noticed something. The scenery was getting lighter at that point, that sort of weird grayness right before a great sunrise. Over the bow of my kayak, there was a giant form, about 15 feet down, as this part of the lake was about 50 feet deep, and it was impossible to see the bottom. Although the creature is like a fish, slightly luminous from the top because of its scales, it was still difficult to see, and if you've ever fished at night, you know what I'm talking about. However, this thing was much, much bigger than even the biggest fish in that lake. When I saw it, I was shocked. I'd been told about this creature before, and now here it was in front of my eyes, and I didn't know what to think. It was the biggest thing I'd ever seen. If I had to guess, it had to have been even longer than the stories say it was. I guess that would make sense, because it had 100 years to grow since the beginning of the sightings. Then as I was deciding what to do, it slowly swam past me. Then I accidentally dropped my kayak paddle. It hit the plastic side of my boat with a loud clunk, alerting the creature to my presence. Its long, snaky form surfaced, and the best way I can describe it was absolutely demonic, like a fish from the deepest pit of the underworld. This thing was ghastly. Its eyes were large and glowed a pale green, like the eyes of a predatory fish. It looked like a giant bass, except for all the teeth. The entire mouth of the beast was ringed in what looked like razor-sharp teeth. It was covered in slimy green scales, each about the size of a large dinner plate, and the creature looked most similar to the northern bass, a fish that this particular lake is known for. All of this I saw in a single split second, as the creature emerged in front of me. I remember it so well because I thought it was going to be the last thing I ever saw. But that little head start was enough for me to outrun it back to shore. Although it was massive, it was quite slow, apparently not needing speed, because it was the apex predator of the water and asserted its dominance through sheer size rather than speed. That's not to say it was slow or anything, though. It gave me a real run for my money in getting to shore, but ultimately I managed to outrun it. The water got too shallow for such a large creature to swim in, and it seemed to turn around when the water got too shallow to come to shore anymore, or it might get beached like a giant whale. Perhaps it'd grown too big to hunt things on land like before, such as the sheep and farmhand I mentioned. When I made it to the shore, the thing was gone. I hurriedly pulled my kayak out of the water and placed the paddle back into it, making sure it wouldn't drift away from where I left it. I don't know why I tried to make sure the kayak was safe instead of getting the heck out of there. But I was finally finished with the kayak, and I ran back towards my grandparents' house. I went right back to bed, but you can probably guess that I didn't sleep much for that night or any other night for the next several weeks. I've never told anyone my story except some older residents in town who informed me of the monster in the first place, and they did agree that it did fit the description they'd heard of the beast. I've always been fond of nature. Ever since I was young, we were constantly moving from city to city, but in every location I would find the nearest nature trail or overgrown, abandoned property and frequent the place as often as I could. At one point, my house was only a few blocks from a very extensive mountain range in New Mexico. This made it all the more saddening. When we moved to western Oklahoma, where almost all property is private and national parks are few and far between, the closest hiking trail to my mother and father's house was the Red Rock Canyon in Hinton, almost 20 miles away, a bit far when you don't have a driver's license and everyone's too busy to drive you there. Fast forward to a few years later, I live on my own in Oklahoma City now and work as a forklift driver. The urge to engulf myself in wilderness persists, but I'm surrounded on all sides by asphalt and metro, save for a few city parks here and there. My only salvation lies in Lake Thunderbird. Anybody from Oklahoma could tell you that Lake Thunderbird is a large national park just south of Norman, with plenty of room for fishing, camping, hiking, mountain biking, and horseback riding. The lake even comes complete with its own sketchy tackle shops and redneck landowners. However, Lake Thunderbird is about 50 miles from my apartment in the city, so the visits are rare. Sadly, my last visit will probably be my final trip down there. I had eaten a large meal to gather energy for the hike. I parked my car on the usual spot, grabbing my walking stick and leaving my phone in the console. I had done this almost every time I hiked to immerse myself and disconnect from technology. Only now do I realize how bad of an idea that was. I had taken the southernmost trail, a very long one that skirted the southern border of the park around to the eastern side. I had never actually used this trail and was kind of in an exploring mood. The first part of the hike was extremely serene. It was a winding trail that led through thick brush and forest across multiple creeks and past multiple herds of deer that seemed to not even fear my presence until I got within 20 yards. However, that serenity was short-lived, as I topped a hill and happened upon what most would call a grisly sight, a femur here, a rib there. For a small fraction of the trail, a mass of bones were scattered around. Given their size, anyone who hadn't hunted deer before may have mistaken some of the bones to be human. Seeing as how I had grown up in a family of hunters my whole life, this sight didn't so much frighten me as it caught me off guard. In fact, deer bones were practically common chew toys for dogs in our house. What I found unnerving, however, was the fact that the spinal cord and jawbone of the animal had been lodged in two trees parallel to each other on the trail. I had seen something like this before in New Mexico. Coyotes were a growing threat to cattle owners, so hunters would hang the bodies of killed coyotes on fence posts at the edge of cattle ranches, kind of like a barbaric pest deterrent. But that logic made no sense here. In my mind, I rationalized that some teenagers had probably found a long-deceased deer skeleton and decided to try and spook some hikers. I kept going, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't bothered. For the next mile or so, the trail only seemed to get worse. Vegetation had overtaken the pathway, and one bridge was in severe disrepair. I had not seen another hiker or rider in a few hours. Eventually, I came upon a fork. The left trail, even in its unkempt state, was far less wild, but the idea of discovering new places excited me and clouded my judgment. I went right, and I very quickly came upon a barbed wire fence that had been cut. I hadn't put two and two together at the moment, but I had just crossed out of the park. Almost immediately, the density of the forest tripled. The canopy seemed to swallow the area in darkness. One thing I noted was that insects in the area were particularly thick. I was constantly swatting at flies buzzing around me. After what had to have been about 30 to 40 minutes of trekking, I started to hear a rhythmic sound in the distance. The metallic grinding of steel on dirt and rock, followed by the sound of dirt falling on dirt. No mistaking it, someone nearby was digging. I don't know if it was that I'd finally realized the oddity of the situation, or I just didn't want to disturb whoever was digging, but I elected to avoid the direction of that sound. I went further into the brush to follow the trail from the side. There wasn't much of a trail to follow anymore anyway. As I passed the direction of the sound at a great distance, I got just a glimpse of the digger. How far away I was, I couldn't see any details, but I could see that they were wearing an old torn coat and a black flop hat with long black curly hair cascading from beneath. I remember remarking to myself how sinister the spectacle was, but told myself that he was probably just a camper snuffing out a fire, and I kept on moving. Not but 2 or 3 minutes later, after I'd passed, the digging sound stopped, which only served to feed my unease. As much as I tried to keep a level head, I was already starting to panic. And just when I was ready to turn in the other direction, I found a large campsite that sent a shiver down my spine. There was one tent, big enough to act as a small house. All around the camp were several axes, hammers, knives, and even a few guns. Multiple sealed crates and barrels littered the center. Off into the trees were 3 pickups with a thick layer of dead leaves, suggesting they had at least been sitting there since last fall, 6 months ago at that point. On the left side of the tent hung 4 deer carcasses that had already been skinned, bled, and dehorned, other antlers piled up on the side. If I had just a little bit longer to look, I'm sure I would have found worse. But almost as soon as I paused to take the place in, I heard the rapid crunching of leaves and branches snapping to my left. As I reeled back in shock, I saw the same figure from before, but much closer. They were stepping quickly towards me. I could now see he was a gargantuan man, clean-shaven, holding a shovel in his left hand and what looked to be a blood-covered axe in the other. His gait as he trampled bushes and small trees in my direction I could only describe as a Jason Voorhees walk. The blood drained from my face, and my stomach dropped to my feet as my legs seemed to start running without me telling them to. I slipped in a small mud puddle and briefly fell to the ground before bolting back the way I'd come. But I'd only run about 6 seconds before a gunshot rang out and a bullet whizzed past my head, blowing out my left eardrum and shattering a nearby tree in 2 splinters. I grabbed my ear reflexively, in pain, and ducked down, trying to take cover while sprinting. Another shot rang out, hitting the branches just above me. 3 more shots would ring out as I put as much distance behind me as I could, but the shots hit further and further away, as if he was hoping a stray bullet would catch me. When I passed the barbed wire fence, I looked back to see if he was following me. No movement, no noise, but I wasn't taking chances. I ran to the ranger station, and I made it, drenched in sweat and hyperventilating. I told the rangers on duty what had happened to me. They gave me some water, told me to rest, and called in a nurse to check on my ear while they called the police. After several long hours of answering questions and waiting for results, the police returned and said the camp had been torn down and abandoned, with nothing left but tent stakes, rifle casings, various animal parts, and 2 of the 3 pickup trucks. I would later learn from the detective that those trucks had belonged to 2 locals who had gone missing long before. It's been 3 years since then. I no longer have nightmares about the man, but the sound of a shovel still gives me chills. I've got a few guesses to what he was digging up or burying, and I can't help but wonder if something happened that day that I could have prevented. Then again, Maybe I should just be grateful that I'm still alive. This happened to me and my now wife when we were on our first date. It was at my parents' house, which is located near a beach, and the sea goes into a stream that runs next to the house into a lake. There are sharks in the stream, but somehow never in the lake. On this particular night, I found out that my father was right, and why there were no sharks in that lake. It was a warm autumn day when we all heard a car door slam shut. I peeked through the blinds and saw that our new neighbors had arrived. 14-year-old me ran downstairs, of course, to peek out the front door window to look at the new neighbors. First, I saw a big muscular man followed by a woman that seemed the same age as the man, but then out of the car came a gorgeous blonde girl my age. I couldn't stop gazing at her until a shout startled me and made my heart nearly beat out of my chest. "Glad I finally got your attention," I heard my mom say. She then looked out the window and then said, "Oh, I see. She's very pretty, isn't she?" My face turned red and I just stuttered. "I'm going to go to the bathhouse to clean up the boat." So I walked over to the boathouse where my dad has this big boat stalled. I had a small boat with an engine there, but I usually use the oars. Both were hanging in the dry docks. I started to clean my boat. I was well over halfway done when I heard a sweet, gentle, feminine voice say, hello?" I looked up and saw that gorgeous girl standing in the doorway. My heart beat faster just looking at her. I dropped my scrub that I had been using. She introduced herself softly. "I'm your new neighbor, Sarah." I stumbled to get out a word, and all that came out of my mouth was, Jack. I'm Jack." Sarah took a step down the stairs leading to the floor of the docks and followed with, "Is that your boat?" To which I immediately replied, "Yeah, it's my own little boat, but sometimes my dad lets me operate his boat when no one's around." She turned her gaze to me and smiled at me, which made me blush. Sarah and I then both heard a woman's voice shouting, "Sarah, where are you? Come on, sweetie. Start unpacking already." Sarah looked me straight in the eyes, biting her lip, an expression that transformed into a beautiful smile, after which she said, I have to go, Jack. See you around." She then slowly walked out of the boathouse and I felt my heart rate finally slow down. Sarah ended up at the same school and the same classes as me, so we started to feel more comfortable around each other. But it was clear to everyone what I felt about her from day one, which only increased with every day we spent together. But we never went on a date until some time later. It was a perfect Friday summer day, and our friends during lunch break left me and Sarah alone. But not without my childhood friend Walter whispering in my ear, "Ask her already, you dunce." Sarah looked weird at me, saying, "I didn't do something wrong, did I?" To which I replied to her, "Don't worry, I'm sure they want to leave us alone for now." She lowered her head, but I could see her biting her bottom lip. She then looked me in the eyes. I could tell she wanted to say something, but then I just blurted out, "Want to go on a date with me?" Sarah looked a bit startled, but quickly after turned red. She just hung her head with a huge smile, saying, "Yes, of course." She then raised her head and said, "But only if you take me out on your boat some night." We both smiled from ear to ear, and of course I excitingly said, "You got it." Sarah then kissed me on the cheek, then ran back into the school with a huge smile. The rest of the day we gazed at each other during classes, but when we were in front of my house after school, we looked at each other, and Sarah said, "So tomorrow night is our date, right?" "Yeah, I can't wait," I said. Sarah replied, "Yeah, same here." We then bid our farewells for the day. After I closed the door, I immediately told my parents, and I made sure everything was going to be absolutely perfect for our date the next night. Soon the next 24 hours or so passed, and it was time for my date with Sarah. I was the most nervous I'd ever been up to that day, but my mom kept reassuring me that it would be all right. A few minutes later, the doorbell rang. There Sarah walked through the doorway looking perfect. She wore a red velvet dress, had her blonde hair up, red lipstick on. But then I looked at her feet and noticed she was wearing sneakers still, the same blue, red, and turquoise-colored sneakers she always wore. "Do you like the dress?" I heard Sarah ask, gently, but with a ton of insecurity in her voice, and I could only get myself to say, "Perfect." Sarah blushed. "So you two just go ahead and have fun, okay?" Was all my mom said, but my level-headed dad only whispered in my ear, "You do know this is just a formality between you two, right?" I gently tapped him in the chest, to which my dad laughed a little, and Sarah and I went to the boathouse. We got out onto the boat and went a bit into the stream. Sarah and I fished in the night, which got darker, but it did present us with a beautiful sunset. Sarah and I hugged each other during it, but we knew our parents were keeping an eye on us. We kept talking until we saw the lights in our parents' rooms go out. I lowered the engine into the water and we went into the lake. Once we hit the lake and I had thrown the anchor in, Sarah stood up and said, "Close your eyes." I looked at her weirdly, which she clearly noticed. She then blurted out, "Hey, just do it, okay?" I closed my eyes and Sarah said, "Okay, now only open them when I say it's okay." After a while I heard a splash and then I heard Sarah speak again. "You can open your eyes." After I opened them, I couldn't see her in the boat anymore, but I did see her dress on the floor of the boat. After searching a few seconds, I saw her head pop up out of the water. "What are you doing, Sarah? You don't know what animals are down there." To which Sarah giggled and replied, "I'm the best in the swimming team, remember?" I stood up, and Sarah said, "So you coming in as well?" I quickly looked around, and for a brief moment in the distance, I saw what appeared to be someone's head just breaking the water. So I just told her, "Well, it looks like we aren't the only ones out here." Sarah smiled and replied, "I'm sure they don't mind us having our date here." I walked over to the edge of my boat and leaned over. Sarah and I gave each other our first kiss. After the kiss, we looked into each other's eyes, but before we could say anything else, something pulled Sarah underwater. She came up a second later, grabbing the edge of the boat and asking, "What was that?" Before I could even speak, she was pulled under again, but this time for a few seconds longer. I tried to grab her hand, but I could not find it underwater. Then suddenly, Sarah came out of the water right in front of me. She was desperately trying to catch her breath. I immediately grabbed her hands, and I could see the terror on her face as she begged me to pull her in. But before she was waist up out of the water, she was violently being pulled back under, and I heard her scream in pain until her head went underwater again. But this time I held on to her, desperately. Yet no matter how hard I pulled to get her back up, it wasn't enough to bring her above water again. I began to look around frantically for the other person I thought I saw earlier, but they were nowhere to be found. Then a very painful feeling erupted in my left hand. Out of instinct, I let go of Sarah's hand. Before I realized what I'd just done, I began to frantically put my hands back in the water, hoping to feel the hand of Sarah and to get her to safety. But then, luckily, Sarah came out of the water again, but before she could catch her breath, I swear I saw a hand go over her head and pull her down under again. Luckily, I was able to grab Sarah's hand this time. I made a promise to myself that I would not let go of her. I had a hold of one of her arms, and I could feel her soft hand trying to grab for mine. Once again, I could not pull her out of that water. Something was violently scratching my hands, but no matter how much it hurt, I wasn't going to let go of her this time. I began to feel the muscles in Sarah's arm going limp. With one last burst of energy, I managed to yank her out of the water. I pulled her over the edge of the boat, and I noticed she wasn't moving. Before I could even remember how to do CPR, the boat was being rocked by something in the water. Huge fins were slamming violently at the boat. I put the engine in the water, and I went as fast as I could go. I made it to the edge of the lake, near the stream's start. Then I looked back toward the water. I saw a head rising from the surface, and I swear I heard a voice, sharp and feminine. No sooner had I heard that, I put the engine back in the water and made my way to the boathouse. The moment I was there, I started CPR on Sarah. Adrenaline and panic surged, and I hoped she wasn't dead. I kept going and going until I noticed Sarah was moving again. She began to spit up water. I then turned her over onto her side so that the water could leave her mouth. It was then that I noticed her entire body was covered in scratches and bruises, but I was just so happy she was alive. When she was able to move better, I grabbed her dress, which she put on. She stood up to walk, but she was walking as if she had just learned how. So I supported her. She kissed me on the cheek, saying afterward, "Thank you." Maybe it was just the moment, but I blurted out, "Well, I love you, so." When I opened the door to the house, she said she was going to spend the night with me, no matter what. As we lay in my bed, she held on to me tightly, and we eventually fell asleep. I didn't sleep much. I was kind of scared she might slip away again. In the morning when we came downstairs together, my parents noticed her cuts and bruises right away, and my mom demanded to know, what in the world happened? Sarah and I looked at each other. Then Sarah said, "Just a rough night. What did you do to her?" My mom interrogated me, but Sarah let her know it was not me. For the next 6 months or so, Sarah had a lot of trouble going into the water again. She nearly lost her position on the swim team. Even still, she doesn't go swimming in open water, and I don't think she ever will. I have a scar on my left hand, between my middle finger and index finger, as a reminder of that night. But the two of us, we're okay. We're happily married, with a little bit of aquaphobia. You may have heard a story by Brett about a demon at Lake Park. Well, I live in that same small town. He and I are actually cousins. He's a year older than me, and we've been friends since we were both small. We've always been mesmerized by ghost hunting and hunting for the paranormal, camping in the deepest, darkest woods we can find, and listening to and telling scary stories. After he told his encounter at the park, I was so excited, exclaiming that we needed to go investigate. Other than some strange noises and a feeling of unease, we found nothing credible. We've gone out there periodically for months, and it never truly showed itself since his experience, and I've never truly seen it. I believed him, but I also thought that maybe they were all exaggerating a small bit. I no longer think that. My experience happened a few days ago, as I'm writing this. On March 14th, I had just turned 17. A few days before that, I was spending my night riding around with close friends. Tommy from the original encounter was with me, along with another friend named Jared. We had been riding around for hours at that point, and somewhat avoided the park upon Tommy's request for family reasons. However, after some negotiating, he finally agreed, but said that he wouldn't look in its direction. Tommy was in the front, and Jared was in the back of my blue Chevy, and we headed out to the park. Jared was more of a skeptic than me and Tommy, so he didn't pay much attention. With the music playing, and me and Tommy in the middle of a conversation, we made our way down that dark road. We soon saw the light poles through the trees, which prompted Tommy to pull up his hood and look at his phone. I simply grinned and rolled my eyes at him as we slowly drove by the park. I rolled down my window and put my truck in park. I waited to see if anything would happen. We sat there for 5 minutes or so. I was the only one paying attention. After a while, I began to put my truck into drive again, but then I took another look, and I froze. There, sticking out from behind a tall tree, was an unusually tall shadow. It was slightly illuminated by the light pole. I stared at this thing for a good 30 seconds before I saw it shift. It was looking as if it was going to start moving towards me. I slammed on my gas and screamed, "To heck with that." I floored it to the lake that was just over the hill. I sat there in the parking lot of the lake, attempting to catch my breath. Suddenly, Tommy sat forward and asked me, "You saw it, didn't you? That's the first time you've seen it." Man, I don't want to sit here if you did. We're way too close to that park. He was right. We were maybe 300 yards from the park, but we had a problem. To get back to town, we had to drive right back by the park. "Yeah, I guess you're right," I said to him. I took a deep breath and prepared to drive by it. Tommy already had his head down, and Jared had AirPods in, paying zero attention to what was going on. As we made our way down that hill, the park came into view, and my heart sank. There, standing in the middle of the light, was the figure. I had a good view of it now. It looked tall before, but now I could tell it was at least 8 feet tall, with disturbingly long arms. But the most horrifying thing was its eyes, deep, endless pools of red, staring right at me. I heard no voices or screams. I simply yelled a curse and flew down that old road full of potholes. I didn't slow down until we reached a stop sign. There, I stayed put, trying to catch my breath again. I told Tommy and Jared I was ready to go home. They agreed and said that if I needed them to let them know. It was a short drive to everyone's houses, and I finally headed for my place after that. When I got in, it was around 11:30. No one was awake, so I simply walked to my room. I said a quick prayer and tried to fall asleep. After a few hours of jumping at every little sound, tossing and turning all night, I finally fell asleep. When I awoke the next morning, I felt a strong burning sensation on my left thigh. I quickly rushed to my bathroom to see what it was. I nearly threw up. On my thigh, there were 3 paper-thin scratches. It may have been scratches, but it felt as if someone had taken a knife to my leg. For lack of a better word, I was terrified, wondering to myself if that thing followed me home. Nothing has happened since then. I've only driven by that park once. I plan to go back to see if I can get any kind of hard evidence, but it's going to take a little bit to work up that courage. I'll keep you posted.